years. Maybe Claudius was given credit for Gallienus' victory, both because Constantine wanted to promote Claudius' memory, and because everyone else wanted to damn Gallienus'. Or maybe Claudius' victory was the real one, and someone transposed a year, leading us to think that it occurred during Gallienus' reign. Or maybe there were two battles, with Gallienus and Claudius each winning a key victory. That's the version I'm going to go with, because it poses the fewest problems in trying to reconcile all the disparate facts and theories about what really happened. So in the history of Rome, both emperors will get their cookie. Gallienus' victory was by no means a complete one, and the Goths were allowed to head home unmolested, as long as they gave up what they had taken, and promised to take no more on their way back north. The emperor would not have long to bask in the glow of his semi-victory, though, nor would he have the chance to follow up with the other Gothic hordes still loose within his empire. Unlike every other time Gallienus had marched out to battle, this time he did not follow the lead of his top general Aureolus. Instead, he left Aureolus in charge of the garrison at Milan, with instructions to keep an eye on both Postumus and the Alemanni, and make sure that neither took advantage of the emperor's absence. As soon as Gallienus left Italy, though, the only one who took advantage of his absence was Aureolus. For whatever reason, the emperor's favorite general decided that now was the perfect time to revolt. The motivations behind Aureolus' revolt are not at all clear, but broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought. Either Aureolus had always been trying to throw in his lot with Postumus, see his suspicious failure to defeat the Gallic emperor previously, or this was an entirely new idea, brought on possibly by the fact that he had been relieved of his command as the captain of the Imperial Cavalry, and left behind to mind the shop, while everyone else went off to fight the Goths. The man who took command of the cavalry, incidentally, was the man who was about to succeed Gallienus, Marcus Aurelius Valerius Claudius. When word came in 268 that his former right-hand man was now in revolt, Gallienus was forced to stop what he was doing, peel off most of the troops he had just raised to fight the Goths, and head them back to Italy. His eastern flank was already badly exposed by the death of Odenathus, and now Aureolus was exposing his western flank to a possible invasion by Postumus. Luckily for Gallienus, Postumus appears to have never indulged in ambitions beyond what he had already achieved. Despite Aureolus begging for aid, and even going so far as to use the mint in Milan to issue coins in Postumus' name, the Gallic emperor never lifted a finger to help Aureolus. There was just no profit in it. If he threw in with the usurping general, he risked everything that he had built. But if he did nothing, well, he risked nothing. And so he did nothing. When the Imperial army returned to Italy, Aureolus and what troops he had at his disposal rode out to meet them, but they were easily routed and forced to flee back behind the walls of Milan. Gallienus settled in to lay siege to the city that he had just helped put on the map, and while he waited for Milan to fall, his officers began to talk amongst themselves. Though I did say last week that much of the supposed dissatisfaction with Gallienus can be traced back to the biases of the senatorial class, that does not mean that there was no dissatisfaction at all. It appears that a cabal of officers, many originating in Illyria, had begun to grow disenchanted with Gallienus' leadership. Just because defending the borders from invasion while simultaneously bringing Postumus and the Palmyrenes to heel seemed really hard, well, that did not mean that it was impossible, and many of the career soldiers in the upper ranks believed that if they had a chance, that they could do a better job than Gallienus. Now this is of course a common belief among, well, anyone who isn't actually in charge, but in this case, it may have been true. Aurelian, who was dealt almost exactly the same hand as Gallienus, was able to do in just 4 years what Gallienus had been unable to do in 8. So eventually, all this insubordinate talk became serious, and a plot was hatched. We will probably never know exactly how Gallienus was assassinated, but the most dramatic account has it that the murder was the result of a clever ruse. Late in the evening, one of the conspirators burst into Gallienus' tent to tell the emperor that Aureolus was leading his men out of Milan on a night raid. Not even pausing to don his armor, Gallienus rushed out of his tent and mounted his horse to go assess the situation for himself. But as soon as he was caught alone and exposed outside the camp, he was cut down by the waiting assassins. It is of course debatable whether this particularly fantastic story is true, but there is no doubt that a conspiracy of top officers got together and killed Gallienus, maybe by the sword and maybe by poison, in 268 AD. Later revisions to history have Gallienus recommending Claudius as his successor, though it seems highly unlikely that Gallienus really spent his dying breaths making noble suggestions about the best man to succeed him. Gallienus was 50 years old, and had been emperor first with his father and then by himself for a remarkable 15 years. When Gallienus died, the officers did indeed rally around Claudius, the captain of the cavalry, which may help explain the later stories about, wink wink, Gallienus recommending Claudius for the job, and then the Senate fell quickly into line. If Aureolus thought the death of his former master would mean that he could extract himself peacefully from Milan, though, well, he was in for a bit of a surprise. Far from granting Aureolus amnesty, Claudius made it clear that everyone inside the city walls was as good as dead if Aureolus' head wasn't brought to him immediately. So, inside Milan, a similar conspiracy of officers dispatched with their chief, and then they came out to make peace with the new emperor, who, once Aureolus was dealt with, was feeling pretty magnanimous. He went so far as to order that Gallienus' family should not be harmed in any way, but the order didn't make it to Rome in time to stop the revenge-minded Senate from executing Gallienus' brother and Gallienus' son. Up in Gaul, Posthumus watched all of this with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had to have been pleased with himself for avoiding getting tangled up in the fight between Aureolus and Gallienus, which had now led to the assassination of both men. But a new leader in Rome meant new policies, and Posthumus had to have known Claudius, if not personally, then at least by reputation. And if Claudius's dissatisfaction with Gallienus in any way stemmed from the emperor's inability to reclaim the Gallic provinces, well, that didn't bode well for Posthumus at all. Fortunately, he would never have to face Rome's final attempt to recapture the West. Unfortunately, it's because he wound up, in the end, sharing the fate of Gallienus and Aureolus and Odenathus. Posthumus's rule had been mostly unopposed, but brief revolts or mutinies had flared up here and there in keeping with the times. In either 268 or early 269, one of his officers along the Rhine decided to make a bid for the throne and had himself declared emperor at his home base in Mainz. Posthumus quickly raised an army and marched in to put the usurper down, and in short order the revolt was squashed. The problem for Posthumus was that now his soldiers wanted to sack Mainz, to punish the city for its disloyalty, yes, but mostly to carry off the wealth of the city for themselves. But Posthumus was the emperor of everyone, and it really wouldn't do to let his army just go and sack one of the key urban centers of his domain, so he ordered the city left untouched. This ticked off his men something fierce, and in a fit of rage they cornered Posthumus and killed him. The rash murder left the Gallic Empire without a leader, and after some confusion, one of Posthumus's officers, a man named Marcus Aurelius Marius, finally stepped forward and attempted to seize power. But he only lasted a few days before being brushed aside and killed by a man named Victorianus, who came from an extremely wealthy family, and whose mother apparently opened up the family bank accounts to buy her son the throne. The near simultaneous deaths of Odenathus, Gallienus, and Posthumus brought to a close the second phase of the crisis of the 3rd century. At the beginning of Phase 3, their successors will duke it out to see whose vision of the future will reign supreme. In the East, Zenobia dreamed of creating a permanent, independent Palmyrene empire. In the West, Victorianus dreamed of simply trying to hold together what Postumus had built. And in the middle, Claudius and his soon-to-be successor Aurelian dreamed of reunification. All three would have to deal with persistent threats to their frontiers, from the Sassanids and from the Goths, and from the Franks and from the Alemanni, all of whom dreamed their own dreams of what the fate of the Roman Empire ought to be. I hate to do this so soon after taking a week off, but there will be no episode next week, as the history of Rome is heading down south to San Antonio to cheer on Mrs. the History of Rome as she runs her half marathon. But we will, of course, be back in 2 weeks for the short reign of Claudius, and then the totally impressive reign of Aurelian, who has fast become one of the history of Rome's most favorite emperors. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. Download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, in honor of the coming rise of Zenobia, everyone's favorite Neo-Cleopatra, I'm going to recommend the new biography of the original, Cleopatra: A Life by Stacy Schiff. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 116, Here Come the Illyrians. As I said at the end of the last episode, the assassination of Gallienus in 268 marked the beginning of the end for the crisis of the 3rd century. In the 33 years since the death of Alexander Severus, the Roman Empire had been on a pretty impressive downhill slide. Emperors were dropping like flies, barbarians were running amok, the empire had broken in 3, disease and famine were rampant. But inch by inch and mile by mile, the successors of Gallienus are about to pull Rome out of its skid and put it back on top of the geopolitical food chain. These successors were notable not just for their achievements, but also for the fact that they all hailed from the same part of the empire. Though I usually refer to the 3rd phase of the crisis period as the recovery phase, it could just as easily be known as the era of the Illyrian emperors. If anyone out there is still clinging to the notion that the Roman Empire fell because it stopped being a Roman Empire, well, I can promise you that it would have fallen a whole lot earlier had it not been for the succession of native Illyrians who pulled Rome out of the ditch that it had driven itself into.